Hi, welcome back. We have one more concept related to synergies that I want to talk about, and that is inter versus intra-temporal economies of scope. Inter-temporal economies of scope are essentially synergies from resources that can be reallocated over time to some new use or purpose. Intra-temporal economies of scope describes those synergies like the 4C synergies that are experienced within a particular time period, and that often is based on either sharing a resource across those business units or allowing different bundles of resources to work together to create more value. So most of the synergies that we'll be talking about are intra-temporal economies of scope, but it's also worth keeping in mind inter-temporal economies of scope. One thing to keep in mind with inter-temporal economies of scope is that if you have resources that can be redeployed over time to new businesses and they can create a lot of value in those businesses, that creates an advantage for diversifying entrants over de novo entrants or entrepreneurs. So if you have some new business coming along, say it's short videos like those produced by TikTok. You have companies like Facebook that have a lot of resources for hosting video. They have a lot of experience in recommendation algorithms and trying to make their apps more and more addictive for their customers. So Facebook has this advantage in trying to create a new business relative to some person starting something from scratch. In this case, that business was already large and growing from TikTok before Facebook decided to enter that business. So some of that disadvantage may have been lost through the delay, but there is intertemporal economies of scope there. An important concept to think about with intertemporal economies of scope is that there are adjustment costs. So even if similar resources are needed for your old business and can be used for some new business, usually there's some effort required to modify or adjust those resources in order to create value in the new business. And that creates a cost for the company. And if that adjustment cost is high enough, even if the resource itself could be valuable in the new business, it may not be valuable enough to justify that adjustment cost. There are things that can be done to manage adjustment costs. One thing that is relevant here is related diversification. So if the resources needed for an old business and a new business are related, that can increase the fungibility of resources. As we talked about previously, fungibility of resources can also be useful for intra-temporal economies of scope. So if you have something like an HR department, that can be very fungible and that can be shared across business units. So when you have relatedness and highly fungible resources, that can create both intra and intertemporal economies of scope. In that case, there is not a trade-off between those economies of scope. The same fungibility and the same relatedness creates value equally for both. Modularity is another way of managing adjustment costs. Modularity means having business units or parts of business units that are highly interdependent within them, but are relatively have low interdependence between them. So if you have two business units within a company, if they interact in many, many different ways, that makes them highly dependent on each other. That allows for greater intra-temporal economies of scope. Essentially, all that joint operation is creating synergistic value, but all of that joint operation and interdependence also creates greater adjustment costs. If you want to reallocate a lot of resources from one of those businesses to some new business, you have the second business unit that you need to think about and all of the ways that they depend on those same resources, and reallocating them to some new purpose might make it difficult to do that without essentially destroying a lot of the synergistic value that you were creating intra-temporally. So when you have high modularity, low interdependence between business units, that makes gives the firm a lot of flexibility. It allows parts to be moved around or recombined as needed. So that modularity increases intertemporal economies of scope, but that same modularity means that you have less joint operation between business units, and that decreases the potential for intra-temporal economies of scope. And this tension creates a trade-off between intra and intertemporal economies of scope. The more intertemporal economies of scope that you want to have with greater flexibility, that requires you to sacrifice some intratemporal economies. If you instead want to create a lot of intratemporal economies, like those 4C synergies, that requires you to sacrifice some flexibility that might be useful down the road if you decide that some of those resources could be valuable for some other business because of that interdependence and joint operation. That reallocation is much more difficult. So again, we're talking about intra versus intertemporal economies of scope. The intratemporal economies are the typical synergies that we have talked about, like with the 4C synergies. The intertemporal economies of scope is essentially talking about the flexibility to reallocate resources over time, and you can create that with more modularity in the firm, as well as having those business units over time be related to each other. You can have this relatedness that does not create any trade-off between intra and intertemporal economies of scope. Having similar resource needs across businesses over time or across businesses within the firm at a given point in time, both allows you to create value either way. With modularity, by contrast, you have this trade-off where higher modularity increases your potential for intertemporal economies of scope, but sacrifices the potential for intratemporal economies of scope. And that's all for intra and intertemporal economy.